We have just been shipped a brand new truckload of Modern Horizons 3 spoilers. If you missed part 1, it's somewhere here on youtube.com. I'm going to be talking about all the cards that got spoiled today, except for some of the boring commons and uncommons. Let's get into it. The remainder of the dreaded free spell cycle from MH3, the flares, have all been spoiled today. The Black Flare has been my most anticipated card for a long time because to cast flares without paying their mana cost, you have to sacrifice an on-color, non-token creature, and Black is really good at doing that with cards like Stitcher Supplier and Bloodghast. I'm really happy with how this card ended up. Flare of Malice says each opponent sacrifices a creature or planeswalker with the greatest mana value among creatures and planeswalkers they control, and it's an instant, which is really nice. And I'm really happy that this is a more reactive answer. I was kind of worried that this was going to be like a really proactive play. I thought maybe it would be like a Hymn to Turok or like a conditional reanimation spell, and I was kind of worried about like a proactive 0 mana spell that you could play alongside cards like this. But I think this ends up being an awesome tool for decks like this. I think just like the vast majority of Modern Horizons 3 cards we've seen so far, this card is very powerful and somewhat flexible, but the deck building restrictions are going to be pretty harsh. I think you're going to see this trend through a lot of these cards. Powerful, has a lot of utility, but just doesn't slot into any existing deck super well, and will likely be a way for newer archetypes to emerge, which is definitely something I've really liked about what I haven't been interpreting about the Modern Horizons 3 philosophy so far. I think this card's pretty good. Doesn't really go in any existing decks. Excited to see if a more like graveyard sacrifice focused build can start to rise to prominence because of this very powerful free spell. Flare of Fortitude is the white flare in the cycle. Can, of course, cast it by sacrificing a white non-token creature. It says, until end of turn, your life total cannot change, and permanents you control gain hexproof and indestructible. I would encourage you to be wary of using this card before wanting to sacrifice a fetch land, because once this is active, you cannot pay any life to activate any abilities. And I think this is going to be mostly a sideboard card. Maybe ends up seeing some main deck play, but it's mostly a sideboard card in decks like Collector's Cage, which tries to use Collector's Cage and Windbrisk Heights to cast big spells, or Colossus Hammer, and in using this as like a 0 mana protection spell on whatever creature is holding the Colossus Hammer. Again, I think it'll be mostly a sideboard card, but that doesn't mean it's not good. Most games of Modern are played post sideboard, and sideboard cards are super important to the format. It's kind of like Force of Vigor to some extent, where that card is really, really good, but it is mostly a sideboard card. Oh, this is kind of the anti-Force of Vigor, the protection that these kind of decks kind of really need. I think this card's good. Going to see a good amount of play in decks that have not been doing so well recently. Finally, we have Flare of Duplication, which I think is the hardest to evaluate out of all of the Flare cycle. It's a fork. It can copy an instant or sorcery spell that's on the stack, and of course, you can play it for free by sacrificing a non-token red creature. Decks built around forks and casting a bunch of instants and sorceries, storm-style decks that I know these kind of decks usually are not very good. This card is 0 mana. It's very powerful. One card that I think it's kind of interesting with is Infernal Plunge. Infernal Plunge lets you sacrifice a creature for 3 red. So like if you did something like played a Mog War Marshal, or if you're just playing a deck that has lots of good red creatures to sacrifice, you can sacrifice 1 to Infernal Plunge with this on stack, 0 mana, Flare of Duplication, copy your Infernal Plunge, and all of a sudden you've gone from 1 mana to 6. I think that's kind of interesting. Copying Manamorphose and other rituals seems pretty good. Some cards, and this was just spoiled today, so I haven't really done a super deep dive, but cards like Mog War Marshal, Burning Tree Emissary, which is like 0 mana, make mana, sacrifice, seems kind of nice. Maybe you could pair this with Arc-like Phoenix, or other Phoenixes in general, like the Collect Evidence Phoenix could be kind of good too. Phoenixes are on color red creatures that that have graveyard synergies to sacrifice. I think this is, again, I don't know that there's any card that really exemplifies what I perceive to be the MH3 design philosophy. Very powerful, very harsh deck building restrictions. This card is super powerful, but building around it is very complicated, convoluted, which is something I personally just love. It's my favorite part about Magic. The rest of the creatures turn into Planeswalker cycle was also spoiled today. My favorite is Sorin House of Markov. I think this card is so cool. I really, really, really like this one. It's a 2 mana 1/4, not boltable. Lifelink Extort, for those of you who have been playing less than 12 years. This is a mechanic from Gatecrash that says whenever you cast a spell, you can spend an extra black or white mana to drain your opponent for 1. And at the beginning of your post-combat main phase, if you've gained 3 or more life this turn, you transform Sorin into Sorin Ravenous Neonate. Still keeps the extort ability, as a static, and you can +2 to make a food token, like Oko. And you can also -1 to deal damage to any target equal to the amount of life you've gained this turn. I don't think that this will likely be how you build around Sorin, but it is kind of cool to think about using Nourishing Shoal to like gain 10 life for 0 mana, then playing Sorin, then transforming it, then doming your opponent for for 10. You could use 2 Nourishing Shoals to win the game on turn 2. Not really a way to build a deck, but sounds like a pretty fun thing to do. And then the -6 lets you gain control of an opposing creature, like Oko, and it becomes a vampire in addition to its other types. I think you can put a lifelink counter on that creature if you control a white permanent other than that creature. And I think this is mostly going to be a buff for food decks. Obviously, this card just pluses 2 to make a food token, but also sacrificing a food token seems to be a really good way to flip Sorin, one of the best ways to flip Sorin. It's also kind of cool that you can use Aether Vial to vial Sorin in. And because you didn't have to use mana to cast Sorin, you could spend that mana to sacrifice a food to flip it like on turn 3. And Aether Vial is really good with some of the other good food cards like Asmo and Academy Manufactor. I think it's also kind of cool that if you can flip Sorin, then you can play Manufactor, then you can 0 mana make a food token. I think that's pretty neat. And also like one thing that when I've built like these kind of food decks in the past is your deck can be like really good at just like drawing a ton of cards and gaining a lot of life and making a lot of mana. But it isn't always that good at just winning the game on those turns. You kind of have to put something else into your deck to actually close things out. But Sorin is like a really good synergistic card that also like if you've like gone through your deck with like multiple manufactors, then you can just like -1 Sorin to win the game immediately, which I think is really, really cool. I like this card a lot. You'll definitely see me play a lot of it. Definitely one of my favorites so far. What is in contention for the cutest Modern Horizons 3 card is Grist Voracious Larva. This card is 1 mana. 1 mana for a 1/2 Death Toucher. When it or another creature enters the battlefield from your graveyard, you can spend a green mana. If you do, exile Grist, transform it into Grist, the Plague Swarm. Oh. Gotta leave that in. Grist, the Plague Swarm. +1, makes a black and green insect creature token. And then you mill 2 cards, and you put a Death Touch counter on that token if a black card is milled this way. I think at -2 to destroy an artifact or enchantment. That is really good in Modern at the moment. And it has an ultimate that's kind of slow to get to, 6 loyalty starting at 3. But for each creature card in your graveyard, create a token that's a copy of it. That's it, except it's a 1/1 black and green insect token, and more or less win the game. Usually win the game is kind of what that says, I think. For 1 mana, this card is crazy. But you have to, be able to meet this deck's restriction. One way that is like really cool to do it is to go like turn 1 Young Wolf, turn 2 Land Grist, use Flare of Cultivation to sacrifice your Young Wolf, get an extra land into play, and then pay the extra green to transform Grist. Could you do this in Yawgmoth? Yeah, probably. Could you just play Grist as a 1 of Court of Calling target in Yawgmoth? Yeah, seems pretty good. Could you play more than 1? Yeah, I think so. There's just like lots of ways you could like try to build around this card without any like super duper clear direction. It's kind of cool with a Biting Grace, also Ranger Captain tutorable targets. You could, just use Unearth with it. You could play it with Bloodghast. There's just like a lot of ways to enable this card. It is kind of nice that it gets turned off by Graveyard Hate as like a little bit of a way to contain the 1-drop, but dude, this card is 1, man. It's also like a 1/2 Death Toucher. It's not like this card just doesn't impact the board either. I think this card is very good. There are 2 1-mana flip Planeswalkers in Modern Horizons 3, as it turns out. We have Tamiyo, Inquisitive Student. 1 mana, 0/3 flyer, very cool stat block. Whenever Tamiyo attacks, investigate. When you draw your 3rd card of the turn, exile Tamiyo, then transform her under your control as Tamiyo's Seasoned Scholar. Kind of cool that you can flip Tamiyo on your opponent's turn. Don't think that'll happen that often, but it's an option. Thankfully, Tamiyo is easier to flip than Grist, where Grist requires some setup. You gotta play a creature from the graveyard. But what do you need with Tamiyo? You can flip Tamiyo turn 2 if you just sacrifice a Mishra's Bauble on your opponent's turn. You go turn 1, Island, Mishra's Bauble. Tamiyo, pass a turn. On your opponent's turn, crack Mishra's Bauble, untap, draw for a Bauble, draw for turn, attack with Tamiyo. Play a land, sacrifice the clue, boom. Planeswalker on turn 2. Planeswalker is not that good, thankfully. Thankfully not that good, but does have a lot of loyalty. Until your next turn, whenever a creature attacks, your Planeswalker gets -1/-0. So almost no effect, but it gets 2 loyalty and gets out of Lightning Bolt range. if it didn't die to bolt to turn 1. And then the -3 is okay, which return target instant or sorcery card from your hand. If it's a green card, add 1 mana of any color. So pick a spell back up, make a mana. That's okay. And then the ultimate, -7, draw cards equal to half the number of cards in your library, rounded up. You get an emblem with you have no maximum hand size. Win the game. Kind of similar to Grist, except the fact that Grist is, I think, a little bit more potent in what it's doing, like disenchanting, putting a creature in play, much better than these abilities. But Tomio is easier to flip, and also just attacking like twice, making 2 clues does seem pretty good. I think Tomio is very good. And I really like that it's kind of incentivizing you to play with green instants and sorceries, because there are not that many good green instants and sorceries. It's like Abundant Harvest, Growth Spiral, Pick Your Poison. There are some, but Cosmic Rebirth is kind of cool too. But I very, very sweet value Planeswalker. This is going to be maybe a growing trend though, but Mishra's Bauble is getting better in Modern Horizons 3. Who could have guessed? Saving red for last again, I guess. We have Ral, Monsoon Mage. Great name. Really cool art. I think that Ral is the worst of all of the creature and the planeswalkers from the cycle. Not that Ral is bad. I just think the other 4 are really, really, really good. I think this one is just kind of mostly an improved Baral or Goblin Electromancer, and those cards have not been very good for a long time. Baral is a 2-mana 1/3. Instants and sorceries cost 1 less. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, you can flip a coin. If you lose the flip, Ral is going to deal 1 to you. This is a pretty real downside. And if you win the flip, you may exile Ral, and if you do, transform into Ral Leyline Prodigy. So I do like that you don't have to flip Ral, because you might want to save your Ral for a little bit on turns you're storming off to use one of these minus abilities. So Ral is going to enter the battlefield with an additional loyalty counter for each instant and sorcery spell you've cast this turn, which is really cool, especially if you've cast like a bunch of Manamorphoses and cantrips. You can +1 to get that cost reduction effect back if you need it. Like if you just want to flip Ral, not take any more damage. That's kind of nice. You can also -2 to deal 2 damage among 1 or 2 targets, and you can draw a card if you control a blue permanent other than Ral. This you probably won't control that many permanents or blue permanents in general. If you're playing with Ral, maybe you also play Baral. I think it's, I don't know, not gonna come up that often, but the -8 is really good. It's Epic Experiment, X equals 8. Exile top 8 cards of your library, may cast instants and sorcery spells from among them without paying their mana costs, and that'll probably win the game in a Storm deck. I think Ral is a really cool Storm card. There are some other interesting Storm cards that have come out in the set. I expect that I'll play with Ral every once in a while, and I have played a lot of Storm in modern tournaments, and it would be cool if this was a step in the right direction, but I at the moment expect this to be way more fringe playable than the rest of the flipwalkers. I'm not talking about all the commons and uncommons that are spoiled today, but there's some really, really sweet ones. This one is Mog Mob. 10 out of 10 name, 10 out of 10 effect. 3 mana 3/3. When you sacrifice it, deals 3 damage as you choose among 1, 2, or 3 targets. So it's like triple Mog Fanatic, 3 Mog Fanatics stapled together. Mog Mob, perfect name. This card I think is really, really cool, specifically in combination with Agatha's Soul Cauldron, where if you're just giving this ability to all of your goblins, you are going to remove all of your opponent's creatures, remove your opponent's life total really quickly in a way that is very difficult for your opponent to interact with. Goblins is also a deck that I think has been pretty underrated, underplayed for a while, and if it gets this, and if it gets like another nice upgrade, I could definitely see it making a big resurgence in MH3. Another 10 out of 10 in the naming department, we have Power Balance, the red version of Counterbalance, but whenever your opponent casts a spell, you can reveal the top card of your library, but instead of countering it, if it's the same mana value, like with Counterbalance, you cast it if those 2 spells have the same mana value. I've really wanted to play a deck with Dragon Rage's Channeler and Counterbalance at the same time, since Channeler is really, really good card, and it is also like one of the best ways to manipulate the top of your library in Modern. The fact that Power Balance is also red, and I think also tends to kind of do Dragon Rage's Channeler things better. I could see these 2 cards playing pretty well together. Power Balance is also the kind of card that you just might play on turn 2, and it like just on average casts 2 or 3 spells for you over the course of the game, and that just might be really good. There's also another new spoiler we'll talk about a little bit more called Brain Surge. It's kind of like new improved Brainstone. 3 mana, draw 4 cards, put 2 from your hand on the top in any order. I would really doubt you play these 2 cards together in the same deck very often, but it is true that Brain Surge is like now the new best top of library manipulation in Modern, and that bar is not very high to jump over. There's not very many good top of library manipulation cards. It's like Channeler, Brain Surge, Brainstone, and Jace, but we're getting there. I do think that Brain Surge is likely going to be more of a Miracles card than a Power Balance card. I don't think Miracles is that bad. The Surveillance ended up being a really big buff to the archetype when the Surveillance came out. We trophied a few times on stream with Miracles, and I definitely felt like I really wanted something better than Brainstone to put Terminus, and better than Jace to put Terminuses on top of my library. Brain Surge is, not just better than Jace, but nice to complement Jace, I guess. I don't. The card's not amazing. But it is card advantage when Brainstone wasn't card advantage. It isn't an onboard trick that your opponents can play around like Brainstone is an onboard trick. And I think that this card would likely get the job done in current Modern. There's a really good chance that post MH3 Modern is just way more powerful than Terminus and Counterbalance. But I won a PTQ with Miracles in Modern one time, and I just love the deck. And Brain Surge is probably not enough, but maybe if we get one more card, we could be back. Deserted Temple, I think, has immediately become my favorite Modern Horizons 3 card. I think it's really simple, it's really elegant, it's super well designed, the art is really cool, and it's very thought-provoking on like where you might put this card into your deck. I think it's really cool to untap lands for mana, like Lotus Field, Cabal Coffers, utility lands like Urza Saga, Fumori Vault, and I've also been brewing a lot with Free Strider Lookout lately, and I've been really wanting a land you could put into play off Free Strider Lookout that can commit crimes, and this it's not always great to untap your opponent's lands, but it just does like commit a crime every single turn, which I think is pretty nice. And you could probably play Temple, Lotus Field, Urza Saga, Lookout all together in the same deck. I love this one. I don't think it's like super good, super broken, but it's a super thought-provoking card that is powerful and interesting and unique, and is just a great space to explore. And I also like really want to appreciate cards like this that are really thought-provoking and really simple. Like this is just tap for mana, one tap, untap target land. There's very little text on this card. Compare this to cards like Free Strider Lookout, Urza Saga that have lots and lots of text. I really appreciate a thought-provoking card with very little text. Would love to see more of these, but I know 30 years into the game, it's not super easy to do that. I don't know why I wasn't expecting to see Kozilek and Ulamog when we saw Emrakul. I should have known that these 3 ride or die together, and when one of them gets a new card, they all get new cards. Kozilek Broken Reality is not close to Modern playable, I think. When you cast a spell, up to 2 target players each manifest 2 cards from their hands. And for each card manifested this way, you draw a card. And then other colorless creatures get +3/+2. So for 9 mana, I really don't like that your 9-drop that needs to be hard cast, and you need to still have 2 cards in hand for your 9-drop to like even be good. And even when you're doing this, it's like just not enough value for 9 mana. This card is worse than other like almost every other big colorless option, I think, in the Modern format, and I expected to see 0 play. I don't expect Ulamog the Defiler to see 0 play. It is a really every single line on this on this card is really interesting. When you cast a spell, target opponent exiles half their library rounded up. Pretty interesting effect here, especially like if you're thinking about this in the context of like sideboard card against like control for Tron decks. It has Ward, sacrifice 2 permanents, which is kind of cool. It's kind of like Ward Annihilator 2 would have been. I guess you couldn't have really templated it that way, but Ward Annihilator 2. And then when it enters the battlefield, it gets a +1 counter equal to the greatest mana value among cards in exile your opponent's control. So usually the highest mana value card in your opponent's deck because you're exiling half of their library. And then Ulamog just has Annihilator X, where X is the number of counters on it. So is this card better than Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger? I think probably not on average. I think if you're going to be playing a 10-man Eldrazi, you probably want Ceaseless Hunger over this most of the time. That being said, this could be a nice sideboard option for those slower, grindier matchups. This could be end up being playing better than the other Ulamog. There could be something about the metagame where exiling half of your opponent's library ends up being pretty good. I think it's a nice tool, something to think about. Neither of these are really on the new Emrakul's level, though, so I would mostly just not worry about these too much. It's been a while since white got like a really good 2-mana value creature, but we're getting one in White Orchid Phantom. 2-mana 2/2 flying for a strike, pretty cool stats on a 2-mana creature. And when it enters the battlefield, destroy up to one target non-basic land, and its controller may search their library for basic and put it onto the battlefield tapped. So I think it's really cool that if you play this in like a mono white deck or 2-color white deck with Flagstones of Tricaire, this card is going to be, whenever you draw Flagstones, 2-mana search your library for planes, and also you get your 2/2 flying first striker. I think that's pretty cool. It's also obviously a nice answer to all of the good non-basic lands in the format. Urza Saga, Tron Lands, Ugin's Labyrinth. I think it's cool to like be able to kill Ugin's Labyrinth on turn 2 and stop them from being able to get the card they exiled away. It's really nice. I think a nice. I really like when cards like this in Modern are main deckable. To some extent, when you're trying to hate out all these big, powerful colorless lands, you can have cards like Break the Ice, Obsidian Charmall, Magus of the Moon, Void Mirror, but these cards are, not super main deckable, and so you have to win both sideboard games, but just having access to a good card like this game 1 can help alleviate a lot of pressure on your sideboard and your main deck, which I like a lot. Big thumbs up for this card. There are so many like pretty playable Eldrazi in the set. We have Thief of Existence with kind of a weird casting cost. Green, colorless, generic, devoid. It's a 3/4. Whenever you cast a spell, you exile up to one target non-creature, non-land permanent opponent controls with mana value 4 or less. If you do, this card gains when this creature leaves the battlefield, the opponent draws a card. So if there's no target, you don't have you just have a 3/4 and you don't have to worry about this. I really like this design that it isn't just awful if you didn't get to exile the thing. Now, of course, it's very important that when we're evaluating Eldrazi to kind of think of them as being one less mana. You're going to be playing these cards with Ugin's Labyrinth, Eldrazi Temple. Ideally, you're tapping one of these to power these cards out. So 2-mana 3/4, deal with a Wrenn and 6, 1 ring, Amulet of Vigor. Seems like a really, really nice tool. Can also like potentially deal with Blood Moon, but you have to have like Waste and Forest, so not super good at doing that. Can maybe deal with Void Mirror, can maybe deal with Winter Moon. Pretty interesting tool. I think that this card will likely make its way into the 75 of like most Eldrazi Temple decks, and definitely one of the best cheap Eldrazi in existence. Echoes of Eternity is another Eldrazi card. It's a Kindred enchantment. Triple colorless, triple generic. This was actually spoiled like a week ago, but I wanted to wait till some more spoilers accumulated to talk about it. This card sucks, I think. I don't think it'll see any modern play. It says, if a triggered ability of a colorless spell you control or another colorless permanent triggers an additional time, whenever you cast a colorless spell, copy it, you can choose new targets for the copy. So if you untap with this card and you have a lot of action, you're going to win the game. That's great, but you just can't play 6-mana cards that you have to untap with to win the game. There are just a lot of big, good colorless cards that actually impact the board when you cast them, and Modern is a very fast format where you just do not have the luxury of saying, all right, I'm going to cast my Echoes of Eternity. When I untap, I'm going to get you. You just are not going to get to untap enough, or you're just going to get this like Haywire Mighted or Besaged or Pick Your Poison. There's just, a lot of good answers to enchantments these days. But very cool card. Likely see a lot of play in EDH. Art is really freaky, which I appreciate. Also spoiled last week, Breaker of Creation, 8 mana, 8/4. Whenever you cast a spell, gain 1 life for each color's permanent you control. Hexproof from each color, Annihilator 2. Likely just like anti-burn sideboard card for these big Eldrazi decks. Maybe not even good enough in that role, just kind of fringe playable, uncommon. Devourer of Destiny was also one of these cards spoiled like a week ago, and unlike Echoes of Eternity, I think that this card will actually be pretty good. It has like this kind of interesting, not quite once upon a time effect, where at the beginning of your first upkeep, you can reveal it from your hand, and if you do, you can look at the top 4 cards of your library, you put one of those cards back on top and you exile the rest. So it doesn't replace itself, it doesn't put the card into your hand, but it lets you set up pretty well for future turns, enabling a little bit of consistency here. And this card is mostly good because it's like, it's a card that's imprintable to Ugin's Labyrinth, which this card is very good. We already kind of have talked this card to death. But it's imprintable to Ugin's Labyrinth, but we'll give you some value before you imprint it, which is really cool. And then it's also like pretty reasonable card to cast. When you cast it, you exile a permanent that's one or more colors, and it comes with a 6/6. Nice solid 2-for-1 that you can buy back with Ugin's Labyrinth. I think that this will likely be a good option for Eldrazi based Ugin's Labyrinth decks. That being said, boy, are they want to make sure you have enough cards to imprint to Ugin's Labyrinth. Between this, all of the big Eldrazi, Null Drifter, you don't have to worry. All is dust. You don't have to worry. You're gonna have stuff to imprint to Ugin's Labyrinth, which is a little scary, I guess. The last card I think that was spoiled last week that a lot of people have asked me about, and a lot of people think is pretty good, is Kozilek's Unsealing. Blue, 2, devoid, 3 mana enchantment. Whenever you cast a creature spell with mana value 4, 5, or 6, make 2 spawn tokens that can sack for a colorless. Whenever you cast a creature spell with mana value 7 or greater, draw 3 cards. So I do certainly agree. If you cast this card and then you start casting cards like Elder Deep Fiend, which sounds so sweet, just chaining Deep Fiends together, drawing 3 cards at a time. Sojourner's Companion, Mirror Enforcer, these kind of cards, you're going to win the game. And it isn't the hardest to do this. Enchantments are a little bit more fragile than they used to be, but you could maybe cast this off of Ugin's Labyrinth on turn 2 and go crazy. You could play this in Affinity, also off of Ugin's Labyrinth, and go crazy, but I don't really feel like this will be the best way to build these kind of decks. It will almost certainly be the coolest way to build these kind of decks. I think we saw this dynamic with Affinity pretty recently, that like experimental synthesizer was like similar Ekam synthesizer was a really good like tool for Affinity. It's a pretty powerful card, but Affinity is an archetype that is bad because it's slow and easy to interact with, and these kind of cards don't really help that dynamic. I'd love to be wrong, and there are a lot of new good Eldrazi, so this card might end up making the cut. It might end up being like a fun way to build the deck. And drawing 3 cards for 0 mana off a Sojourner's Companion is certainly a very powerful thing to do. Just in case you weren't sick of casting Mishra's Bauble in Modern, they've printed 6 Wren's Companion, 3 mana, 2/4 reach. Whenever it attacks, you get to mill 3 cards, and you can put a land from those into your hand. And as long as it's your turn, non-land permanent cards in your graveyard have retrace. So it is really cool that you can play this card on turn 3 and then like retrace Mishra's Bauble a lot, and it's to kind of cycle any amount of lands in your hand and do this like, before your opponent untaps and kills your 6 potentially. I think that this card is probably just like a little too slow, a little bit too janky to like really build a deck around, but I think it is powerful. If it untaps, you just get to like attack and like just almost draw 2 cards, because like milling is just so valuable when all of your cards have retrace. 2/4 means it's unboltable. It can be discounted to 1 mana via Heartless Summoning. It's doing some cool stuff. I expect to not cast it for a long time, just not like in the top 30 most exciting cards for the set. But like if this was a standard set, we'd be playing this week 1, and I'll likely get around to it at some point. Okay, I was wrong about Kozilek's Unsealing being the last previously spoiled card to talk about, because there was also a Basking Brood-Scale. 2 mana, 2/2, devoid, so it's colorless, and it can, for green and 1, adapt 1 to put a counter on it, and whenever 1 or more counters are put on it, you can make a 0/1 spawn token that can sack for a mana. This card is mostly interesting because it goes infinite with Rosy Cotton. Whenever you make a token, you put a counter on target creature other than Rosy. That creature will be this card. So you're going to have this card be infinite power, and you're going to have infinite mana and infinite O1s, infinite colorless mana from your spawns. Kind of simply put, these 2-card creature combos have not been good in Modern for a long time, and you have to have a good reason to play them over Yawgmoth. I think Amalia combo is kind of good. Is this combo better than Amalia combo? It seems close. It's also kind of cool maybe to pair this with Bristly Bill. Like you play Brood-Scale turn 2, you go Bill, fetch land, make 2 spawns. I don't know. Could be kind of cool. probably not something we're going to get to super soon either. Kind of envisioning also maybe playing Aether Vial on turn 1, and then on turn 3, vialing this in, casting Rosy. It's cool. It's cool, and it is better than a lot of these combos. But I'm a little bit hesitant to think that it'll actually be like a lasting deck in Modern. You know, Collector's Cage just came out. This card is really good. I've been playing it a lot on stream in combination with Wimber's Kites, trying to like put a bunch of creatures into play and then use either Collector's Cage or Wimber's Kites to cast a big spell. And in addition to the White Flare, we also have Thraben Charm, which seems like a great sideboard option for these decks. Mode number 1 lets you deal damage equal to twice the number of creatures you control to any creature. So, nice removal spell. Can also destroy an enchantment and also exile your opponent's graveyard. Nice flexible sideboard card. Something I would probably play like 2 of in these Collector Cage decks. Really, really cool. I also just like love charms. Charms are super cool. I'd love to have more charms in Magic. These kind of modal, flexible spells are just some of my favorite parts of the game. Now, I was really not expecting to see new MDFC lands in Modern Horizons 3, especially ones that can enter untapped if you pay it 3 life. These are the good ones. But here they are, and both these cards look pretty good. The better of the two is probably Witch Enchanter. It's 4 mana, 2/2, enters the battlefield, destroy target artifact or enchantment an opponent controls. And of course, and it can be a white untapped land if you pay 3 life, or tap land if you don't. What's cool about this card is just pretty main deckable. If you're playing like a white mid-range or control deck, it just is an untapped land that can also function as like a nice 2-for-1 disenchant that has a really low opportunity cost to include. Disciple of Freylise is also really cool. It's a 6 mana 3/3. Whenever it enters the battlefield, you can sacrifice another creature. If you do, gain X and draw X, where X is that creature's power. It's a reference to Disciple of Bolas, which is a 4 mana 2/1, where you draw X and lose X equal to the sacrifice creature's power. So kind of a cool play on that card. And it's also a green land. It's also something you can Summoner's Pact for. Like, this is now the ability to Summoner's Pact for a tapped land in Primeval Titan. So you can Pact for this and like just play it as a tap land, untap with amulets, which I think it will come up sometimes that you have like an amulet in play or 2 amulets in play, 4 mana, Summoner's Pact, Primeval Titan, and then this just lets you have the mana, which is kind of scary. I don't actually really even think you're going to see this card see much play outside of that application or like Belcher or Oopsal spells, because obviously MDFC lands very good in Belcher Oopsal spells. Don't need to talk too much about that. Those decks don't like to play real lands. But it would be cool if this card could see play somewhere else. Like, it is an elf. Like, you could play this in your elf deck potentially. It's kind of cool that just enters untapped and taps for green, and then in the late game it's kind of like a small card draw spell. But we'll see. I'm kind of curious to see, is this a cycle? Because we have a green one and a white one. Do we also get the Grixis colors? That would be kind of interesting. MH3 is also giving us a cool Pokemon evolution of Mirror Enforcer. We have, of course, the original 7 mana 4/4 affinity for artifacts, 0 mana 4/4, very cool. Just kind of strict power level upgrade from Modern Horizons 2. Same text, but also has the ability to cycle for any artifact land. But here in MH3, we have the unholy infusion of both Frogmite and Mirror Enforcer. For same thing, 7 mana 4/4 affinity for artifacts, but you could also play it as a red 3 2/2 that still has affinity for artifacts, so like a 1 red mana Mirror Enforcer. You also can just like completely ignore the red cost of this card if you want to, and just say, okay, I have 12 Mirror Enforcers in my Ugin's Labyrinth affinity deck, and you're going to be able to imprint cards to Ugin's Labyrinth very consistently, but you should probably have some red sources, I think. So pretty nice upgrade, definitely playable, especially in the context of Ugin's Labyrinth, but ultimately just kind of a reflavored version of a card we've seen a couple times. Elves has been one of my biggest pet decks in Modern for a long time, and I do maintain that the deck is better than people think it is, but it still is not very good. It's getting a pretty nice upgrade in the form of Priest of Titania. Being able to chord for 2 for your mana engine instead of 3 is nice. You can untap it with Corian Ranger. And we're also, we're upgrading Elvish Archdruid with Priest of Titania, and now we get to upgrade our Realm Walkers to Aladamri Corvic Doll. So it's a 3 mana 3/3 instead of a 3 mana 2/3. You can cast any creature spell from the top of your library. So if you boarded some non-elves in post-board, or if you're playing like Voha in your main deck, you can cast those. And it also has the ability to tap 2 untapped creatures you control, so not including this, so 2 other ones, and a green. And you can reveal a card from your hand or the top of your library and just put that card into the battlefield. So it can like put a Voha or a Craterhoof Behemoth, or I guess Disciple of Freyles. You're seeing live right now some gears turning, just putting this into play. This kind of actually makes a lot of sense. That is probably what they want us to do with this card. So a nice little upgrade, some cool stuff. This ability doesn't matter as much as you probably think it was. You're mostly playing this for the Realm Walker ability, so that you can play this and then immediately like make a lot of mana and start casting elves from the top of your library with your big mana engine. You'll play like anywhere from like 1 to 4 of this card, probably starting at 2 or 3. And it'll go in the deck for sure. But will the deck be good? We probably need like 2 more cards. So we have Pearl Ear, who I assume is Light Paul's advisor, or maybe they're both advisors to a different like Spirit Fox that cares about auras. 3 mana, 3/4 lifelink, enchantment spells you cast have affinity for auras. Pretty cool. Costs 1 less for each aura you control. And whenever you cast an aura spell on a modified creature, so a creature that already has an aura on it probably, you'll draw a card. This card is a 3 mana 3/4 with no protection. It requires you to play a bunch of auras in your deck, so it is just going to die to removal and just not be a playable plan. But it is very cool. Seems like a good commander. Just not the right format. Volatile Stormdrake was spoiled today. Kind of a confusing card. It's a 2 mana 3/2 hexproof from activated and triggered abilities. So cannot be solituded, cannot be leyline binding, cannot be it's a very time raveler. And I think this is mostly so you can't like play it, trade it for your opponent's creature, and then bounce it back with Teferi Time Raveler. I guess I'm getting a little ahead of myself. This card, when it enters the battlefield, you can exchange control of it and any other creature your opponent controls. And then if you do, you get 4 energy, and then you sacrifice the stolen creature unless you pay an amount of energy equal to that card's mana value. So if you steal a creature with mana value 4 or less, you can keep it. If you don't, you just get 4 energy, and then you sacrifice that creature. So kind of a hybrid creature stealer / removal spell. And it's also kind of cool that if you just cast this card on turn 2 before your opponent has a creature, then it's just a 3/2 flyer with hexproof from activated triggered abilities. That's pretty good. So it's like also if you just put it in your main deck, it's not a dead card against like Tron and blue-white control. Pretty bad if your Titan opponent goes turn 1 to Boreal Grazer though. I don't know. This card is interesting. It really does not seem like it's going to line up very well against the current modern format. It mostly seems really good against Yawgmoth, and I really like that the hexproof from activated triggered abilities is triggered abilities or leyline binding solitude can also not be bounced back to your hand with Teferi, and can also not be killed by Yawgmoth in response to the trigger. Very heads up ability on this card. Good job, play design team. So maybe just like a sideboard card against Yawgmoth. Maybe it's just like the kind of card that is good in some metagames, maybe not. Maybe it's the kind of card that just never really finds a home, but it's on my radar and it seems to be very interesting at the very least. A really cool Phoenix got spoiled today. I'm always a big fan of Phoenixes. This is Detective's Phoenix. Who's Detective? I don't know. Maybe this is like a standard issue Phoenix. 3 mana 2/2 flying haste. You can also bestow for 1 red mana and collecting evidence 6. If you don't remember this mechanic, because there have been a few like this recently, you have to exile 6 total mana value from your graveyard. So it itself is either a 2/2 flying haster, it's giving something, +2/+2 flying and haste, and you can also bestow from your graveyard. Reminder that if you bestow this onto a creature, like an aura, it falls off and becomes a creature itself if the creature was enchanting was on it. So pretty cool piece of value. Could play this in Dragon Rage's Channeler decks. It's also only 3 mana, so it's like pretty castable. You don't always have to be bestowing this. It's an enchantment creature, so if you play it in the Channeler deck, it's 2 types for Delirium, which is kind of cool, although you kind of wanted to get it out of the graveyard. I don't know. I like this card. I think it'll see some very fringe play just because it's so niche in what it's doing, but it is certainly a powerful card. I remember when this card first got printed, Brea Ethereum Shaper, I bought the Precon because I really wanted to have a Precon commander deck so I could play with people just getting into the format, and I had like a mid-level deck and like a higher level deck I could play with different people depending on what their deck's power level was. And I remember thinking, Wow, Brea is like a lot better than Pia and Kira Nalar, which was like a really good modern card at the time. There was like a lot of Pia and Kira Nalar in modern. Like this is a 4/4 instead of a 2/2. It has these really cool modes where I can kill things and I can uh, deal damage to players and I can gain 5 life. But the casting cost is really weird. Could you see? I wonder if this card was printed in modern if it could be playable. I remember having like this exact dialogue tree. It's now like 8 or 9 years later, and this card seems to be likely superpower leveled out of the modern format. Unless you're like cheating it into play because it's an artifact and you can't even do that with like Goblin Engineer. I don't see this card like even being good if it was easy to cast, but the card is also not very easy to cast. It is white, blue, black, red, so you don't even have the luxury of having green mana fixing very easily. I mean, you could play it in a 5 color deck, but just not as good as Omnath, and I think, time has maybe passed this one by. If this card had been printed into modern 8 years ago, I've been really excited about it. Now, I will probably never cast the card, but never say never. We also have, I'm sorry, Arna Kinnerud? Kinnerud? Sky Captain? Probably a different way to pronounce that. 5 mana, flying lifelink, ward, discard a card. I love that they're putting ward on these like 4 or 5 mana creatures because it's very tough to consider these cards without these kind of text. And says whenever a modified creature you control attacks, double the number of each kind of counters on it, and for each non-token permanent attached to it, so auras, create a token that's a copy of that permanent. So really cool abilities, pretty powerful. It can protect itself with ward, but it's an Esper 5-drop. It's just a really ugly casting cost to see on your modern card. Without cheating this card into place somehow, I don't see how you would ever really play it, and I don't really see how you'd want to cheat this out instead of an Atraxa and then still also have a bunch of auras to play. But it's cool, build a commander deck around it, I guess. Glimpse the Impossible is a new cool common printed today. It's not that often that I really like soak in like the art and the flavor of a card, but it's kind of cool to just see Gisela being, turned into monstrous Eldrazi. The art is really cool. I appreciate this a lot. Um, so Glenn says exile the top 3 cards of your library. You may play those cards this turn. So immediately, oh no, you can't play these till the end of next turn. That's not usually very good on these kind of effects, but don't worry, because if you didn't play those cards, you can make an O1 spawn token instead, which is kind of interesting. So either kind of hybrid card advantage spell slash mana generator is pretty interesting. A lot of times you're just gonna like cast this, make 3 spawns, and untap on turn 3, and then try to go off on turn 4. It's also like a pretty good spell to copy with Flare of Duplication. I think that it's cool. It's cool to copy with Flare of Duplication. I think you could maybe even pair it with Battle Hymn. You like to like just make a bunch of tokens to make a bunch of mana. Maybe copy Battle Hymn with Flare. You can't sack the spawns to cast Flare for 0 mana, so you have to do something else. But there's a lot going on here. There's a lot going on here. Gets discounted by Ral, Monsoon Mage. I'm sure I'll cast this card at some point, and then we'll figure out exactly how good it is then. Grim Servant, very cool. 4 mana zombie, 4 mana, 3/2 menace. When it enters the battlefield, search your library for a card with mana value less than or equal to your devotion to black. Reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle, lose 3 life. Not a very good card, but is really cool in combination with Heartless Summoning. Just being able to play like a 2 mana creature tutor that tutors up like your cool payoff for Heartless Summoning sounds really fun. Sounds like also like more like an F&M deck unless several more good creatures get printed for Heartless Summoning. But also, I will say this, I've tried to build around Heartless Summoning for a while. Heartless Summoning is a really cool mana engine. It's worked better sometimes than others, but it's basically never worked that well with black creatures just because there's a really big lack of like good 4 or 5 mana creatures with like ETB effects. They printed some more over the last couple of years with like Shieldred, Hostile Investigator, Grief, but we're just like a little ways away. But this is maybe a step in the right direction, but unlikely to be a super competitive card in a strategy. So we have the kind of aptly, maybe poorly named, I'm not sure, Wheel of Potential. The card does have potential. It's a Wheel of Fortune reference, 3 mana sorcery. You get 3 energy. Then you can pay up to X energy. Each player may exile their hand, so your opponent doesn't have to get rid of their hand, and then draw X cards. If X is 7 or more, you can play those cards that you exiled until the end of your next turn. I guess kind of simply put, like wheel effects in modern are bad for the most part, unless you're like pairing them with Narset, and this card doesn't actually work with Narset because your opponent doesn't have to exile their hand. It also, like, if you're trying to pair this with Orcish Bowmaster, your opponent just doesn't have to exile their hand. And like these are kind of like the best things you can do with wheel effects in Modern. This doesn't do that, and if you're just using it as like a card draw spell, it isn't a particularly good one. So I don't know what you're supposed to do with this, or like what they want us to do with this. If there happens to be like a super broken energy generator, then sure, let's give it a go, I guess. And then we could just put this like with Ruby Medallion and the new Ral, and then we can like ritual, and then like draw a bunch of cards. But if you're just like gonna ritual and then draw three, it just isn't enough. Like this Wheel of Potential like isn't as good as Glimpse the Impossible, by my current estimation. But it's also true that wheel effects like this have just never been good in Modern, and the dynamic of Modern is about to change. So maybe, potentially, but right now I'm giving it a big thumbs down. I was really not expecting this card to get printed into Yawgmoth, but I am like kind of familiar with it. This is Crick, Son of Yawgmoth, Post Malone's Secret Lair. Uh, Secret Lair. What do you call this? So I had seen these in the leaks on Twitter a couple weeks ago, but the medallions are being printed into Modern, which I think is pretty cool. I think they're like really appropriate power levels, and I think they're going to be interesting build arounds, and I don't think they're going to see too much play. So if you're not familiar, these are 2-mana artifacts that have their corresponding color spells cost 1 less to cast. I think that the white, black, and green ones will see very little to no play. Maybe they'll see some, right? But I think that you mostly want to focus on the blue and the red ones, especially the red one, because you're discounting Manamorphose, Pyretic Ritual, all of these like cool storm spells that chain together. The red one's definitely going to be the best. I think the blue is kind of interesting too. It's really cool with Urza specifically. You can play this on turn 2, then you can play Urza for 3 mana, and then tap this for mana. I think that that's kind of neat, and I don't know. They're cool. I will definitely try to build with all of them. The red one is the most promising, but it's like I'm not like I might build Ruby Storm like week 1, week 2, but I'm probably not getting to the rest of them for a while. But that's nice. That is what's nice about Modern Horizons 3. It's such a deep set. It's really gonna take some time to really unearth all of the potential of all of the cards. Shadow of the Second Sun got spoiled on today's stream, and I was definitely talking a lot of trash about it, but the card is definitely better than it looks. It is definitely an EDH card, but it is kind of cool and kind of interesting. So there's a 6-mana enchant player. I don't really know why it isn't just an enchantment. Like, is it because you want to play politics at EDH and buff someone else, or is it because you want to be able to cheat out an aura? It's not a curse. I don't know. But at the beginning of each enchanted player's post-combat main phase, there's an additional beginning phase. So you have an untap, an upkeep, and a draw step at the beginning of your post-combat main phase. So what you're going to do with this card is cast it in your pre-combat main phase, go to combat, then you get to untap all of your lands or all of the artifacts you spent to cast this. So, and then you get to draw a card and theoretically do any upkeep effects too. So if you have 6 mana, you get to cast this, then untap all of your lands and draw a card. So it's kind of like Time Warp for 6 mana. That will double your mana at every turn after this, and will also draw you a card every turn additionally. So it kind of reminds me of Wilderness Reclamation in that it's an expensive enchantment that gives you all of your mana back the turn you play it. It's 2 more mana, but it also gives you a card additionally, which is a big deal, and it also lets you cast spells at sorcery speed. So it's kind of like the sorcery speed Wilderness Reclamation. It kind of casts Time Warp every turn, including the turn you play it. So I was definitely talking a lot of trash today. It's very expensive. It's not very often that 6 drops are playable, but this one breaks a lot of conventions of 6 drops, and I think it actually could see some play, assuming you can power it out or cheat it out, or I don't know. I have not ruled it out. We'll see. Ginku Future Shaper is a pretty cool 4-mana 2/5. This is a card that maybe like 10 years ago would have been kind of interesting in the context of Modern. And it is doing some cool stuff, but it's just like a 4 mana kind of dopey creature that whenever a non-token permanent you control leaves the battlefield, you can do one of these that hasn't been done this turn. Make a 2/2 Fox with Vigilance, a 1/2 Moonfolk with Flying, or a 1/1 Rat with Lifelink. And for 5 mana, you can put a counter on each creature you control. I like that this card can be triggered off Mishra's Bauble and Fetch Lands, the two best enablers in the format. But this card is also just a 4 mana creature that is very fragile and not doing a more powerful thing than cards like Yawgmoth and Urza do, I think. Not a card I would completely rule out, but not one I'm looking to play anytime soon. Kali of the Vast is a really iconic commander card. I remember losing to this a lot in college, where I had this Melira deck, and I just every time the Kalia player would bring out Kalia, I would just get crushed. 2 mana 2/2. Whenever it attacks, you can put an angel, demon, or dragon from your hand onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking. This is a really powerful ability, but this card is awful. It is completely unplayable in the context of Modern. 4 mana 2/2 that you have to untap with and have a big thing in your hand to do. You could make the argument, oh, I could Goryo's Vengeance my Kalia, and then put something big into play. But you could also just Goryo's Vengeance the thing. You could just Goryo's Vengeance the Gristlebrand or the Attract, so you don't need to use Kalia to put it into play. Would not consider building around this card unless some crazy card was like super broken with it, but very, very far away from the realm of playability. There were also a lot of alternate art treatments to old existing cards that I really appreciate. I love that Wizards does stuff like this. Specifically, Channeler and Unholy Heat, I have wanted in the retro border for a long time. I'm really happy that they're coming. Very, very cool. This is the end of this round of the video. There's likely going to be a few more of these as Modern Horizons spoilers come out. I'm going to try my best to stay on top of it, but there's a lot to do. Thank you for watching and making it this far in the video. I will be streaming Modern nonstop. I guess I do that already, but I'll be doing it even more so when Modern Horizons 3 comes out. So you can find me over on twitch.tv/aspiringspike. Thank you. Goodbye.